Hey guys, tonight the chimes of cobblestones, hunger, hope, and the London fog. The world did not wake up with the sun in Victorian London. It woke with the rattling of iron-rimmed wheels and the rhythmic, bone-deep ache of the girls who owned the dawn. Long before the first gray smear of light touched the spires of St. Paul's, the fog, thick, yellow, and tasting of coal smoke, claimed the streets. They called it a pea souper, a sulphurous shroud that turned the gas lamps into dim, ghostly eyes. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter. The thin wool was a pathetic defense against the damp chill that rose from the Thames. She was 15, but in the flickering gaslight, her face held the hollowed-out wisdom of a woman of 40. Beside her, the Covent Garden market was exhaling. It was a heavy, wet breath of rotting cabbage stalks, bruised oranges, and the metallic tang of horse manure. "Move it, you little scrap!" a drayman roared. His whip cracked like a pistol shot over the heads of the heavy Shire horses. Eliza didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. To flinch was to lose your footing, and to lose your footing in the garden at 4 in the morning was to be swallowed by the black mud. "Apples! Sweet pips! A penny a bag!" she tried to shout, but her voice was a raspy ghost of itself. She cleared her throat, spat a bit of soot into the gutter, and tried again. "Red jennetings! Bite 'em and forget the frost!" Around her, the girls who wake the city were emerging from the shadows like specters. There was Polly, barely 7 years old, her hands stained a permanent bruised purple from hauling crates of plums. There was tall Martha, whose back was permanently curved like a question mark from a decade of carrying heavy baskets on her head. They were the invisible machinery of the empire. They were the friction that kept the city from grinding to a halt while the lords and ladies slept in their silk-lined beds. The chaos was a symphony of survival. You had to hear the specific pitch of the cobblestones to know what was coming behind you. The sharp, rhythmic clack, clack, clack meant a high society carriage. Hasten out of the way or be crushed. The slow, grinding thud meant a vegetable cart. Stay close, for a fallen potato was a feast. "Eliza," a voice whispered from the fog. It was Nell, her eyes wide and bloodshot from lack of sleep. "The beadle's coming up the east side. He's in a foul mood today. Says the mud on the pavement is a sin against the Queen." Eliza stiffened. The law in London was a strange thing. It ignored the hunger, but it prosecuted the presence of the hungry. "Let him come," Eliza muttered, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "He can't arrest the fog, and he surely can't arrest a girl for standing where God put her." But God felt very far away from Covent Garden. The gas lamps flickered, struggling against the soot. In that light, the market looked like a battlefield. Crates were stacked like ramparts, the screams of traders were the war cries. This was the hunger. It wasn't just the emptiness in the belly, it was the frantic, vibrating energy of thousands of people trying to earn enough in 1 hour to live for the next 2. Suddenly, a gentleman in a silk top hat stepped out of a hansom cab. He held a scented handkerchief to his nose to block the stench of the commoners. Eliza watched him. To him, the girls were merely part of the scenery, like the soot on the walls or the rats in the sewer. He didn't see the way Polly's fingers trembled with the cold. He didn't see the hope tucked away in Eliza's pocket, a single crumpled handbill she'd found about a ship sailing for the Americas. "Red jennetings, sir." She stepped forward, her best market smile plastered on her face, a mask of subservience. "Only a penny, sweeter than a sweetheart's kiss." The man didn't even look at her. He tossed a copper coin into the mud, not out of charity, but to make her move out of his path. Eliza dropped to her knees. She didn't care about the silk-hatted man's disdain. Her fingers plunged into the freezing muck, searching, clawing, until they closed around the cold, hard circle of the penny. She stood up, wiping the mud on her apron. 1 penny. That was 2 loaves of day-old bread. That was a candle for the cellar. That was one more day of breathing. The chimes of the church clock struck 5. The sound vibrated through the fog, heavy and mournful. The city was officially awake now, but for the girls of the market, the hardest part of the day was already over, and the longest part was just beginning. As the morning progressed, the character of the market shifted. The girls who wake the city were no longer the only ones on the stones. Now came the shopkeepers, the costermongers with their donkey carts, and the dreaded inspectors. Eliza shifted her weight. Her boots were less of a footwear choice and more a collection of holes held together by stubbornness. "Fresh lavender, scent of the heavens!" The cry came from a girl no older than 10, standing near the pillars of St. Paul's Church. Her name was Tilly, small, hair the color of rusted iron. Eliza watched as a wealthy woman, draped in velvet, pulled her skirts away from Tilly as she passed. The woman didn't just avoid Tilly, she looked through her, as if the girl were made of the same gray air as the fog. "That's the trick of it, isn't it?" a voice rumbled nearby. It was Barnaby, the blind, an old man who sat on a crate of rotten turnips, playing a fiddle with strings that squealed like trapped rats. "The trick of being a ghost while you're still breathing," Barnaby said. "To them, you're just a shadow. You're the coal that burns in their hearths, the water they drink, but to their eyes, you're nothing but a smudge on the glass." Eliza looked at her hands. They were stained with the black juice of bruised apples and the grit of the street. "I don't feel like a ghost, Barnaby. My stomach is too loud for a ghost. My feet hurt too much for a shadow." "Then keep shouting, girl," the old man grinned. "Shout until the fog cracks. If you stop shouting, that's when the city truly swallows you." Eliza took his advice. She filled her lungs, ignoring the sting of the sulfur. "Apples, crisp as a winter morning, 10 for a penny. Don't let your children go hungry while the queen dines on gold." It was a risky shout. Mentioning the queen and hunger in the same breath could earn a girl a night in the cold cells of Bow Street. But it worked. A clerk in a frayed frock coat stopped, moved by a sudden pang of guilt. He handed over a penny. The metal was warm. He must have been holding it in his pocket. Eliza felt a rush of electricity as the coin hit her palm. It wasn't just money. It was a physical manifestation of time. As the clerk walked away, a black carriage, polished like a dark mirror, rolled through the center of the market. The driver used his long whip to clear a path, flicking the tips near the faces of the flower girls. Inside the carriage sat a young girl, perhaps Eliza's age. Her skin was the color of fresh cream. Her hair was tied with ribbons of silk. For a second, their eyes met. The girl in the carriage looked at Eliza's torn shawl and soot-stained cheeks. Eliza looked at the lace collar and the warm fur muff. There was no hatred in the look, only a vast, terrifying distance. Then the carriage splashed through a puddle of oily sludge, soaking Eliza's skirt. The carriage didn't slow down. The girl inside didn't blink. Eliza stood frozen. The cold mud dripped down her chin. Around her, the market roared back to life. "Liza, you okay?" Tilly ran over, wiping her own nose with a sleeve. Eliza didn't answer immediately. She reached up and wiped the mud from her cheek. She didn't cry. Tears were a waste of moisture in a place where you were already damp to the bone. "I'm fine, Tilly," Eliza said, her voice now hard, like the stones beneath her. "I was just thinking about the chimes. The fog is gonna lift one day, Tilly, and when it does, they're gonna have to look at us. They won't have a choice." Bread for a farthing, the brutal edge of survival. The sun was a myth. The hunger was the only truth. By mid-morning, the adrenaline of the dawn rush in Covent Garden had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, gnawing ache that felt like a parasite living beneath Eliza's ribs. In Victorian London, hunger wasn't just a feeling, it was a physical weight.
It slowed the blood, it made the vision blur, and it turned every passing stranger into a potential source of a single life-saving crust. Eliza stood by the soot-stained brickwork of a tea warehouse, counting her coins for the 5th time. 2 pennies and a farthing. The copper felt greasy in her palm, slick with the sweat of the day's labor and the dampness of the fog. 2 pennies were for the rent, the square-footed damp floorboard she shared with 3 other girls in a cellar in 7 Dials. If she didn't pay, she would be back on the penny hang, sleeping upright over a rope with 20 other vagrants. That left the farthing. A farthing, the smallest heartbeat at a British Empire's economy. To the men in the counting houses of the city, a farthing was a nuisance, a speck of dust to be brushed off a ledger. But to Eliza, that tiny scrap of copper was the thin, vibrating line between survival and the slow descent into the black shakes of starvation. "The baker's at the corner of Drury Lane," now whispered, her voice thin, vibrating with a desperate craving. "He's got the seconds out, yesterday's loaves, hard as a horse's hoof, but they'll fill the gap." They walked with a purpose, keeping their heads down. In this part of London, to look hungry was to look weak, and to look weak was to be preyed upon. They passed the gin palaces, where the smell of cheap juniper and rot wafted through the open doors. Men and women lay in the gutters, their hunger drowned in liquid fire. Eliza looked away. She knew that path. It was a shorter route to the grave, paved with temporary warmth. The bakery was a narrow, soot-stained building that smelled of heaven and teased like hell. The scent of warm yeast and toasted grain was so thick it felt like something you could chew. A line had already formed, not a line of customers, but a line of ghosts. Women with babies wrapped in rags, old men with shaken hands, and the market girls, the morning stars, now dimmed by the exhaustion of the day. "Next," the baker barked. He was a man made of flour and fury. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms as thick as hams dusted in white powder. When Eliza reached the counter, she placed her farthing on the wood. It looked pathetic against the scarred, flour-dusted oak. "Bread for a farthing," she said, her voice firm, though her knees felt like water. The baker didn't look at her face. He reached into a bin behind him and pulled out a scrap loaf, the burnt edges, the fallen crumbs, and the dough that hadn't risen, all pressed together and baked into a hard gray brick. "Price has gone up, girl," the baker grunted. "Grain is scarce. This is worth a halfpenny today." Eliza felt a cold jolt of panic. "The sign says a farthing for seconds. I've stood here an hour, sir. That farthing is all I've earned since the chime struck 6. Please." The baker finally looked at her. He saw the rip in her shawl. He saw the mud on her chapped cheeks. For a second, a flicker of something, maybe a ghost of a conscience, passed through his gaze. He shoved the scrap loaf toward her and swept the farthing into his heavy apron. "Take it and go before the beadle sees me giving charity." "It's not charity," Eliza whispered as she stepped back into the cold. "It's a debt the city owes me." Outside, she and Nell huddled in the lee of a brick wall to escape the wind. Eliza broke the bread. It didn't tear, it snapped. It was gritty with adulterants, sawdust or ground chalk used to stretch the flour. It tasted of ash and old ovens. But as the first piece hit her stomach, Eliza felt a surge of heat. It was the most important transaction of her life. She was buying another 4 hours of existence. Suddenly, a commotion broke out. A merchant's cart had hit a pothole near the gutter. A small sack of flour had burst, spilling a white cloud onto the wet black stones. Before the driver could even pull the brake, a dozen shadows detached themselves from the walls. People were on their knees, scraping the flour, mixed with horse dung and street filth, directly into their pockets, their hats, and their mouths. It was a feeding frenzy of the forgotten. Eliza didn't join them. She stood still, her hand tight on her hard gray bread. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of dignity that hurt more than the hunger. She was a seller of apples. She was a girl of the market. She was not a dog in the street. "Come on," Eliza said, pulling Nell's arm. "We have more work to do. There's a shipment of watercress coming in at the wharf. If we're fast, we can carry the bundles for a halfpenny." "But your feet, Liza, they're bleeding through the rags." Eliza looked down. The red stains on the gray cobblestones looked like small macabre flowers. The stones don't care about blood, and neither does the stomach. Walk. If you stop walking, the hunger catches up, and if it catches up, it never lets go. The day dragged on. The hunger remained a constant companion. They moved toward the Thames, where the air was even colder, smelling of salt, sewage, and the deep, dark secrets of the river. Every step was a battle. Eliza could feel her muscles trembling. The black shakes were trying to take hold. She forced herself to think of the America handbill in her pocket. In America, the stories said, the wheat grew so tall it brushed the sky. They said bread was so plentiful that people threw the crusts away. Eliza didn't need a golden palace. She just wanted a world where a farthing didn't decide if she lived to see the moon. The chimes of a distant clock tower struck noon. The sound was heavy, rolling over the fog like a funeral bell. "One more farthing," Eliza whispered herself, her fingers clutching the last scrap of her hard bread. "One more, and I'll see the stars tonight." She stepped onto the wharf, the wind howling off the water like a banshee. She was tired, she was cold, and she was starving, but as long as she could stand, she was undefeated. The fog swirled around her, trying to pull her into its gray embrace, but Eliza held her ground. She was a girl of London, and she knew the price of bread.
The sulphur shroud, the breath of the iron beast. The sun had been murdered. By mid-afternoon, the weak gray light of London was completely strangled by the arrival of the great fog. This was no ordinary mist. This was the pea super. It was a thick, oily, sulphurous blanket, the color of rotting limes and coal ash, that descended upon the city like the breath of a dying beast. Eliza stood at the edge of the Strand, and for the first time in her life she could not see her own feet. The world had vanished. The buildings, the horses, the faces of the people, everything was swallowed by the yellow shroud. It felt as if the city had been dipped in liquid smoke, a heavy claustrophobic pressure that pressed against the eardrums and made every breath feel like swallowing a mouthful of grit. "Stay close now," Eliza called out, her voice sounding muffled as if she were speaking through a heavy wool blanket. "Don't let go of my shawl. If you lose the line, the fog will take you, and I won't be able to find you until the morning bells." In Victorian London, the fog was more than weather. It was a character, a silent, creeping predator that knew every alleyway of the East End. It was a threat to the lungs and a sanctuary for the soul. It smelled of thousands of coal fires, of gas leaks from broken mains, of the river's ancient rot, and the metallic tang of the ironworks. It burned the back of the throat. It made the eyes weep. But for a market girl, it was also a shield. Under the cover of the sulphur shroud, the rigid rules of the city began to dissolve. The social hierarchy of England, usually as stiff as a starched collar, became fluid. "Can't see the beetle now, can we?" Nell whispered, her hand gripping Eliza's garment with white-knuckled intensity. "He could be 2 feet away, and he'd never see us breathing his air. He could be reaching for us, and we'd be like ghosts in his fingers." Eliza nodded, though the movement was lost in the gloom. "It's the only time we're truly equal now. In this fog, the Duke in his carriage is just as blind as the beggar in the gutter. The silk dress gets just as filthy as the rag.
For a few hours, just a few precious hours, the city belongs to the shadows. But the sanctuary had a price. The fog was a playground for the lurkers and the mudlarks. Somewhere to their left, a woman screamed, a short, sharp sound that was abruptly cut off by the heavy dampness of the air. It wasn't a scream of pain, perhaps, but one of sudden fear. Then came the sound of running footsteps, heavy and rhythmic against the wet stones, fading into nothingness before they even seemed to start. Sound in a pea souper was a liar. A carriage could sound miles away when it was right upon you. A murderer could be breathing against your neck, and you would only smell the sulfur and the cold. "Hish!" Eliza hissed, pulling Nell into the recessed doorway of an apothecary. The door smelled of dried herbs and old wood, a small comfort against the chemical stench of the street. Suddenly, a figure loomed out of the yellow dark. It was a link boy, one of the ragged children who carried flaming torches to guide the wealthy through the gloom. The boy's torch sputtered and hissed, throwing a sickly, flickering orange glow that only made the fog look more demotic. It was a pocket of fire in a sea of ash. "Sixpence to the hotel! Light your way, sir! Sixpence for your life!" the boy cried out, his voice cracking with the cold. A businessman, lost and trembling with fear, grabbed the boy's shoulder as if it were a life raft. They disappeared into the shroud, the orange light fading until it was just a pinprick, and then darkness again. "We have to move," Eliza said, her voice a low vibration. "The wharf is just ahead. If we can find the crates we left near the tea house, we can sleep beneath the tarpaulin. The fog will keep us warm, or at least it will hide our shivering from the night watchman." They began to navigate by touch. Eliza ran her hand along the soot-caked brick walls. Each texture told a story she had learned by heart. The smooth, cold stone of the Bank of England, the rough, jagged brick of the tenements, the freezing iron of a street lamp that had long since flickered out. Suddenly, the air grew colder. The smell of the sulfur was joined by the ancient, salt-heavy scent of the Thames. They were at the water's edge. Here, the fog was at its thickest, a swirling white-yellow vortex that felt like being trapped inside a giant diseased lung. The river was invisible, but they could hear it, a low sucking sound against the wooden pilings of the wharf. "Liza, I'm scared. What if the world doesn't come back? What if the sun has forgotten us, and the fog stays forever?" Eliza paused. She reached out and found Nell's face in the gloom. Her skin was damp with the London ivy, the black soot water that settled on everything. Eliza felt a surge of protective rage. "If the world doesn't come back," Eliza said, her voice suddenly fierce and resonant, "then we'll build a new one right here in the dark. No beetles, no workhouses, no hunger that we have to hide. Just us and the silence. If they can't see us, they can't hurt us." They found the crates near the East India Wharf. They crawled into the narrow gap between the heavy wood and the stone wall, pulling a discarded piece of heavy, salt-crusted canvas over themselves. Inside their small makeshift cocoon, the air grew slightly warmer, thick with the smell of their own breath. The sounds of London reached them as if from another planet. The mournful foghorns of the ships on the river, bwah-oom, bwah-oom, sounded like giant prehistoric animals crying out for their mates in the deep. The distant, muffled chimes of Big Ben struck the hour, but the sound was distorted, ghost-like, stripped of its golden authority. In the silence of the shroud, Eliza felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. For the first hour in a day of endless bone-breaking toil, she didn't have to be a market girl. She didn't have to put on a mask. She didn't have to run. The fog had taken the world away, and in doing so, it had given her back her soul. "Listen," Eliza whispered. "To what? I don't hear nothing but the river," Nell asked. "The quiet, now. Listen to the quiet. It's the only thing in this whole city that doesn't cost a farthing." They lay there, two small sparks of life, tucked away in the massive, soot-stained heart of the empire. Above them, the sulfur shroud swirled, hiding the crimes of the rich and the miseries of the poor, leveling the city until the sun, far away and forgotten, decided to fight its way back to the cobblestones. But for now, the fog was their mother. It was their wall. It was their secret. Eliza closed her eyes, the taste of coal and hope lingering on her lips, and for the first time in a long time, she slept without looking over her shoulder.
Blooms in the muck, Beauty and the Beast of the Streets. By the time the fog began to thin into a gray, watery drizzle, the flower girls had taken their stations. In the hierarchy of the market, the flower girls were a strange contradiction. They dealt in the delicate, the fragrant, the beautiful, yet they lived in the most brutal, filth-ridden corners of London. They were the blooms in the muck, standing on street corners where the sewage overflowed the gutters, holding out bunches of violets and primroses as if offering a piece of heaven to a city that smelled of hell. Eliza watched them from across the piazza. She was an apple seller, a girl of hard fruit and heavy crates, but she had always envied the flower girls. There was a certain grace to them, even the ones with coughs that shook their thin frames. "Violets, ma'am, a penny for a sweet scent? Hide the smell of the river, sir? Only a penny." The voice belonged to Rose, a girl whose name was the only beautiful thing she owned. Rose stood near the entrance to the opera house, her boots submerged in a thick black slurry of mud and horse manure. Her hands, red and swollen from the biting cold, moved with surprising tenderness as she arranged a bouquet of drooping lilies. "It's a lie, isn't it?" Nell whispered, standing beside Eliza. "Selling flowers in a place where nothing grows. It's like painting a smile on a corpse." Eliza shook her head slowly. "It's not a lie, Nell. It's a protest. Look at her. She's standing in the filth, but she's holding on to something that isn't dirty. That's why the rich buy from them, not because they want the flowers, but because they want to believe that beauty can survive the soot." Suddenly, a carriage pulled up, splattering Rose's threadbare skirt with a fresh wave of street grime. A young gentleman stepped out, adjusting his silk cravat. He looked at Rose with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Here," the gentleman muttered, tossing a silver sixpence toward her tray. "Give me the freshest ones, and be quick about it. The air out here is positively poisonous." Rose didn't flinch at his tone. She picked the best of her stock, white roses that seemed to glow against the gray backdrop of the city, and handed them to him. As the gentleman turned away, he dropped one of the roses. It fell directly into the black muck of the gutter. He didn't stop to pick it up. To him, a ruined flower was just a lost penny. Eliza walked over as the carriage rattled away. She looked down at the rose. It was half submerged in the oily water of the street, its white petals already staining brown. Rose was staring at it too, her expression unreadable. "Waste of a good bloom," Eliza said softly. Rose looked up. Her eyes were dark, shadowed by a lack of sleep that no amount of flower selling could hide. "It's not wasted yet," Rose said. She reached down, plunging her hand into the freezing, filthy muck, and retrieved the rose. She wiped it on her apron, which was arguably just as dirty as the street, and then did something Eliza didn't expect. She took a small vial of water from her tray, rinsed the petals, and tucked the rose behind her own ear. "There," Rose smiled, and for a second the grime on her face seemed to vanish. "Now it's not a commodity. Now it's just mine." "How do you do it, Rose?" Eliza asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "How do you stand here all day, smelling the rot, and still care about a petal?"
Rose leaned in, the scent of her violets clashing with the heavy smell of coal smoke. "Because if I don't, Eliza, then the muck wins. If I stop seeing the flower and start only seeing the mud, then I'm already dead. We all are." The struggle of the flower girls was a daily war against the gray. They fought the soot that tried to turn their lilies black. They fought the frost that tried to turn their primroses to ice. And they fought the people who saw them as nothing more than pretty weeds to be stepped on. Later that afternoon, the rain turned into a downpour, the kind of London rain that feels like it's trying to wash the city into the Thames. The flower girls didn't move. They pulled their shawls over their baskets to protect the blooms, sacrificing their own warmth for the sake of their inventory. Eliza watched a group of them huddled together under the eaves of the portico. They were laughing. It was a sharp, jagged sound, but it was laughter nonetheless. They were sharing a piece of dry bread and passing around a single battered tin of lukewarm tea. In that moment, Eliza realized that the beauty they found wasn't just in the flowers. It was in the sisterhood. It was in the way they tucked a stray bloom into each other's hair. It was in the way they refused to let the literal and metaphorical filth of the Victorian streets extinguish their spirits. They were the living proof that even in the darkest, dampest cellar of the empire, something could still reach for the light. "Apples!" Eliza shouted, her voice joining the chorus of the market. But as she shouted, she looked at the white rose tucked behind Rose's ear, now wilted, now bruised, but still white, still there. She adjusted her own heavy basket, the weight of it feeling a little lighter. She wasn't just selling fruit, she was part of the machinery of survival. And as long as there were flowers in the muck, there was a reason to keep walking. The cost of a curtsy. The invisible wall. The fog had lifted just enough to reveal the towering limestone majesty of Belgrave Square. Here, the air was different. It didn't taste of sulfur or rotting cabbage stalks. It tasted of expensive beeswax, coal smoke from clean chimneys, and the cold, sharp scent of privilege. In the markets of Covent Garden, a girl was judged by the strength of her back, but here, in the West End, she was judged by the silence of her footsteps. Eliza stood at the wrought-iron gates of a mansion that looked like a fortress of white marble. In her arms, she held a crate of the finest forced strawberries, grown in a house at immense cost, each berry glowing like a ruby against the winter gloom. She looked down at her hands. She had scrubbed them with sand until they were raw, but the black lines of the market remained etched under her nails, a permanent, indelible map of her class. "Don't just stand there gaping, girl. You're letting in the cold," a voice snapped. The servants' entrance, hidden away like a dirty secret, opened with a groan of heavy oak. A man in a waistcoat so stiff it looked like plate armor stepped out. He was the butler, the high priest of this temple of wealth. He looked at Eliza, not as a human, but as a smudge of soot on a pristine white tablecloth. "The strawberries, for Lady Gwendolen," Eliza said, her voice sounding small and brittle against the vast, echoing silence of the square. "Round the back, use the servant stairs, and for heaven's sake, wipe your boots again. The mud you're carrying is older than this house." Eliza followed. She entered a world of ticking clocks and polished copper. The kitchen was a hive of silent, frantic activity. Servants moved like ghosts, their eyes never rising above the level of the floorboards. Suddenly, a bell rang, a sharp, insistent ting-ting-ting that echoed through the stone corridors like a summons from an angry god. "You," the cook whispered, pointing a floured finger at Eliza. "The third-floor maid is occupied with the mistress's corset. Take the tray up, room 3. Don't speak, don't look, and whatever you do, curtsy until your knees hit the carpet." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She climbed the back stairs, a narrow, winding spiral of stone that led from the world of steam to the world of velvet. As she ascended, the air grew warmer. The smell of grease was replaced by the scent of lavender and expensive French perfume. The carpets began to swallow the sound of her leaking, hobnailed boots.
She pushed open the door to room 3. The room was an explosion of silk and sunlight. Lady Gwendolen, a girl no older than Eliza herself, sat before a mirror of silvered glass. She was being sewn into a gown of pale blue satin, a color so pure, so impossibly clean, that it made Eliza feel like a creature made of river mud. Eliza stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat. The silver tray trembled in her hands. She remembered the cook's warning. She sank into a curtsy, her joints cracking audibly in the suffocating silence of the room. "You're late," Gwendolen said. She didn't look at Eliza. She looked at Eliza's reflection in the mirror, as if the real girl weren't worth the effort of turning her head. "The fog, my lady. The horses couldn't see the turns," Eliza whispered, her head bowed. Gwendolen finally turned around. For the first heartbeat in history, a girl of the upstairs truly looked at a girl of the downstairs. The silence stretched, heavy, awkward, and filled with the ticking of a gold watch on the mantelpiece. Gwendolen's eyes drifted over Eliza's frayed shawl. She noted the hollows beneath Eliza's cheekbones. She saw the raw red skin of Eliza's wrists where the wind had bitten deep. "What is it like?" Gwendolen asked suddenly. Her voice wasn't cruel. It was filled with a terrifying, detached curiosity. "My lady? The market, the noise. I hear it from my window sometimes, a low, hungry roar, like a beast pacing in a cage. Is it true you all sleep on the stones like animals?" Eliza felt a spark of heat in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. She straightened her back, forgetting for a moment the cost of the curtsy. She looked Gwendolen in the eye, a defiant, forbidden act. "We don't sleep on the stones if we can help it, my lady," Eliza said, her voice growing steady and resonant. "We sleep in the gaps between the crates. We sleep in the warmth of the bakery vents. And the noise, it isn't a beast. It's the sound of thousands of people trying to stay alive for one more hour. It's the sound of work." Gwendolen flinched, as if the word work was a physical blow. She reached out and touched a strawberry on the tray, her white, soft finger contrasting sharply with the deep red fruit. "It sounds exhausting to care so much about a single day." "It is, my lady. But it makes the taste of that strawberry mean something more than just a sweet on the tongue. To us, a strawberry is a miracle of the sun. To you, it is just a Tuesday." The air in the room seemed to freeze. The maid who was pinning Gwendolen's hair gasped and nearly dropped her shears. Eliza realized she had stepped over a line that no market girl was ever meant to cross. She had shown her soul to someone who was only supposed to see her service. "Leave the tray," Gwendolen said, her voice turning cold and distant again. The mask of the aristocracy, thick and impenetrable, slid back into place. "And take a shilling from the bureau for your honesty. It is a rare thing in this house." Eliza looked at the silver shilling sitting on the polished mahogany. It was more than a week's wages. It was a fortune of copper and bread. But as she looked at Gwendolen, who was already turning back to her own reflection, obsessed with a stray hair and a silk ribbon, Eliza felt a strange, sudden wave of pity. She took the shilling. She sank into one last deep curtsy, a perfect performance of the role she was born to play. "Thank you, my lady," Eliza said. She backed out of the room, down the velvet stairs, through the copper-scented kitchen, and out into the cold, gray reality of Belgrave Square. The heavy iron gates clanged shut behind her, a loud, metallic reminder of the world's divide. She stood on the cobblestones, the silver shilling hot and heavy in her hand. She had seen the upstairs. She had seen the gold, the silk, and the silence.
But as she breathed in the soot-heavy, honest air of the street, she felt a sudden, fierce rush of belonging. The upstairs was a beautiful cage, warm, silent, and dead. The downstairs, the market, the mud, it was a battlefield. But at least on the battlefield, you knew you were still fighting. You knew you were alive. "The cost of a curtsy," Eliza whispered to the wind, "is too high. They think they own the world, but they don't even know the color of the dawn." She turned her back on the white mansion and began to run, back toward the fog, back toward the noise, and back toward the only world that knew her name. Gin palaces and gaslight. The golden trap. The fog did not lift, it merely changed its hue. As the clock struck 8, the gray gloom of the London evening was pierced by a violent artificial brilliance. The gas lamps, the devil's candles, flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the wet cobblestones. But even the gas lamps were dim compared to the incandescent glow of the gin palaces. These were the cathedrals of the poor. They were the only places in the empire where a market girl could see her own reflection in a gilded mirror, the only places where the air was warm and the light was gold. Eliza and Nell stood across the street from the Golden Swan. The palace stood out like a diamond in a coal bucket. Its windows were massive sheets of plate glass, etched with swirling patterns of ivy and roses. Inside, the light reflected off 1,000 brass fixtures and polished mahogany surfaces. "It looks like a dream, doesn't it, Eliza?" Nell whispered, her eyes wide as she watched the heavy oak doors swing open. "It's a trap, Eliza," said Nell, though she couldn't tear her eyes away from the warmth. "They give you the light so you'll forget the dark, and they give you the gin so you'll forget the hunger." But the cold was a persistent enemy. It had been 16 hours since they had stood in the dawn mist of Covent Garden. Their bones felt like they were made of ice. Their skin was raw from the salt and the soot. The promise of the roaring fire inside the palace was stronger than any warning. They pushed through the doors. The sound hit them first, a wall of noise that smelled of juniper, cheap tobacco, and the collective breath of 500 desperate souls. It was a roar of laughter that had no joy in it, a cacophony of shouting, singing, and the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of glasses against the marble counter. The interior was staggering. Chandeliers, heavy with crystal drops, vibrated with every passing carriage outside. The walls were covered with mirrors, enormous gold-framed mirrors that made the room look infinite. Eliza saw herself. She saw a girl with tangled hair and a face smudged with the black dust of the coal docks. Beside her, in the reflection, was a gentleman in a velvet coat. For a moment, in the trick of the light, they looked like they belonged in the same world. But then the gentleman moved away, a look of pure disgust as his sleeve brushed Eliza's shawl. "2 glasses of blue ruin," Eliza said, sliding 2 coppers across the brass counter. The barman didn't look up. He moved like a mechanical clockwork doll, filling the glasses with the clear, biting liquid that was the lifeblood of the London slums. Eliza handed a glass to Nell. "Drink it slow. It's not for the taste, it's for the fire." As the liquid hit her throat, Eliza felt a searing, medicinal heat. It was harsh. It tasted of turpentine and industrial chemicals, but it did its job. Within seconds, the shivering in her limbs began to subside. The ache in her feet retreated into a dull, distant memory.
This was the danger of the gaslight. Under its glow, the secret ambitions they had whispered in the dark felt achievable. The America handbill in Eliza's pocket felt like a real ticket, not just a scrap of paper. "Look at them, Liza," Nell said, pointing to a group of flower girls dancing in a corner. They were spinning in circles, their ragged skirts flared out like broken wings. They were laughing, their mouths wide, their eyes glazed with a temporary liquid happiness. "They've found their America, Nell," Eliza said softly. "But they'll wake up tomorrow in the same muck, with a head that feels like it's being hammered on an anvil." Suddenly, the music, a frantic, screeching fiddle, stopped.
A man in a tall velvet hat stepped onto a small wooden stage. He was the crier of the palace. "Listen up, you beautiful scavengers! Who wants to earn a crown? Who has the stomach for a wager?" A roar went up from the crowd. In the Jinn Palace, a wager was often the only way to turn a copper gain into a golden dream, but the price was usually dignity or blood. Eliza watched as a young girl, no older than 12, was pushed forward. The wager was simple. Eat a bowl of devil's porridge, a mixture of oats, sand, and hot peppers, without drinking water. The crowd cheered, tossing coins onto the stage. It was a spectacle of cruelty, lit by the most beautiful chandeliers in the world. "Let's go now," Eliza said, her voice turning cold. The warmth of the gin had turned into a sick weight in her stomach. "The light here, it doesn't show you the truth. It just hides the rot under a layer of gold leaf." As they stepped back out into the night, the transition was brutal. The cold hit them like a physical blow. The darkness of the street felt absolute, the gas lamps now looking like lonely, dying stars. Eliza looked back at the palace. From the outside, with its glowing windows and the muffled sound of music, it still looked like a paradise. But she knew better now. "The Jinn Palace is for the people who have given up on the dream, Nell," Eliza said, pulling her shawl tight. "We haven't given up. We don't need their golden light. We have our own fire." She reached into her pocket and felt the silver shilling. It was still there. It hadn't been spent on Blue Ruin. It hadn't been lost in a wager. They began the long walk back to the rookery. Behind them, the gaslight continued to flicker, a silent siren call to the hungry and the hopeless. But Eliza kept her eyes on the dark road ahead. She knew that the only way to reach the Golden West was to keep walking through the London mud, unblinded by the palace and unbroken by the night. Jinn Palaces and Gaslight, the Golden Trap. The sun had long since surrendered to the soot, and the evening market had taken on a different, more predatory pulse. As the clock struck 8, the gray gloom of the London evening was pierced by a violent, artificial brilliance. The gas lamps, those devil's candles, flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the wet cobblestones that looked like black, oily glass. But even the gas lamps were dim compared to the incandescent glow of the Jinn Palaces. These were the cathedrals of the poor. They were the only places in the British Empire where a market girl could see her own reflection in a gilded mirror, the only places where the air was warm and the light was gold. To a girl who spent 14 hours a day in the damp rot of Covent Garden, a Jinn Palace was not a bar, it was a sanctuary. It was a beautiful, dangerous lie. Eliza and Nell stood across the street from the Golden Swan. The palace stood out like a diamond in a coal bucket. Its windows were massive sheets of plate glass, etched with swirling patterns of ivy and roses. Inside, the gaslight reflected off 1,000 brass fixtures and polished mahogany surfaces, creating a shimmering haze that promised forgetfulness. "Look at them, Liza," Nell said, whispering with eyes wide and dilated, catching the amber glow from across the street. "Like a dream, doesn't it, Liza? Like a palace where the queen might sit, if the queen were hungry and cold." "It's a trap, Nell," Eliza said, though she felt the pull of the warmth in her very marrow. "It's a golden trap with a velvet lining. They give you the light so you'll forget the dark, and they give you the gin so you'll forget that your stomach is trying to eat your ribs." But the cold was a persistent, cruel enemy. It had been 16 hours since they had stood in the pre-dawn mist. Their boots were soaked with river water. Their skin was raw from the salt and the soot. The promise of the roaring coal fire inside the palace was stronger than any moral warning. They pushed through the heavy brass-handled doors. The sound hit them first, a wall of noise that smelled of juniper, cheap tobacco, and the collective humid breath of 500 desperate souls. It was a roar of laughter that had no joy in it, a cacophony of shouting, singing, and the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of glasses against the marble counter. The interior was staggering. Chandeliers, heavy with crystal drops, vibrated with every passing carriage outside. The walls were covered with mirrors, enormous gold-framed mirrors that made the crowded room look like a vast, endless ballroom of the damned. Eliza saw herself in the glass. She saw a girl with tangled hair and a face smudged with the black dust of the docks. Beside her, in the reflection, stood a gentleman in a velvet coat. For a brief flickering moment in the trick of the light, they looked like they belonged in the same world. But then the gentleman moved away, his lip curling in disgust as his slick sleeve brushed Eliza's ragged shawl. 2 glasses of blue ruin, Eliza said, sliding 2 hard-earned coppers across the brass counter. The barman didn't look at her. He moved with the mechanical efficiency of a clockwork doll, filling the glasses with the clear, biting liquid that was the lifeblood of the slums. Blue ruin, mother's ruin. It had many names, but only one purpose: to stop the world from hurting. Eliza handed a glass to Nell. "Drink it slow now. It's not for the taste, it's for the fire." As the liquid hit her throat, Eliza felt a searing medicinal heat. It tasted of turpentine, juniper berries, and industrial chemicals, but it did its job. Within seconds, the shivering in her limbs began to subside. The ache in her feet, the sharp, stabbing pain of the cobblestones retreated into a dull, distant memory. This was the danger of the gaslight. Under its artificial glow, the secret ambitions they had whispered in the dark felt achievable. The America handbill in Eliza's pocket felt like a real ticket, not just a scrap of paper. "Look at them, Liza," Nell said, pointing to a group of flower girls dancing in a corner. They were spinning in circles, their ragged skirts flared out like broken wings. They were laughing, their mouths wide, their eyes glazed with a temporary liquid happiness. "They've found their America, Nell," Eliza said softly. "But they'll wake up tomorrow in the same muck, with a head that feels like it's being hammered on an anvil." Suddenly, the music, a frantic screeching fiddle, stopped. A man in a tall velvet hat stepped onto a small wooden stage. He was the crier of the palace. "Listen up, you beautiful scavengers! Who wants to earn a crown? Who has the stomach for a wager?" A roar went up from the crowd. In the gin palace, a wager was often the only way to turn a copper gain into a golden dream, but the price was usually dignity or blood. Eliza watched as a young girl, no older than 12, was pushed forward. The wager was simple: eat a bowl of devil's porridge, a mixture of oats, sand, and hot peppers, without drinking water. The crowd cheered, tossing coins onto the stage. It was a spectacle of cruelty, lit by the most beautiful chandeliers in the world. "Let's go now," Eliza said, her voice turning cold. The warmth of the gin had turned into a sick weight in her stomach. "The light here, it doesn't show you the truth. It just hides the rot under a layer of gold leaf."
They stepped back out into the night, and the transition was brutal. The cold hit them like a physical blow to the chest. The darkness of the street felt absolute, the gas lamps now looking like lonely, dying stars. Eliza looked back at the palace. From the outside, with its glowing windows and the muffled sound of music, it still looked like a paradise. It looked like hope. But she knew that by tomorrow morning, the girls inside would be back on the street corners, their pockets empty, their dreams evaporated with the alcohol. "The gin palace is for the people who have given up on the dream, Nell," Eliza said, pulling her shawl tight around her frozen ears. "We haven't given up. We don't need their gaslight. We have the sun, even if we have to wait in the dark to see it." She reached into her pocket and felt the silver shilling. It was still there. She hadn't spent it on the ruin. She hadn't gambled it on a wager.
They began the long walk back to the rookery, their feet heavy, their breath blooming in the cold air like white ghosts. Behind them, the gin palace continued to glow, a silent, beautiful siren call to the hungry and the hopeless. But Eliza kept her eyes on the dark road ahead. She knew that the only way to reach the golden west was to keep walking through the London mud, unblinded by the palace and unbroken by the night. The shadow of Newgate, the iron hand of justice. The fog in London did not just hide faces, it hid the law. But there was one place where the fog felt thinner, where the very stones seemed to radiate a cold, judgmental breath. This was the shadow of Newgate Prison. To the girls of the market, Newgate was not just a building, it was a dark, monolithic promise. It was the final destination for every girl who tripped over the invisible line of survival, a grim, soot-blackened reminder that in the eyes of the empire, poverty was very often the greatest crime of all. Eliza and Nell were forced to pass the prison walls on their way to the early morning scramble for the discarded crates. The air here felt different, heavy with the smell of damp granite, iron rust, and the unwashed misery of 1,000 souls trapped behind bars. "Don't look up, Nell," Eliza whispered, her voice barely a thread in the wind. "Keep your eyes on the mud. To look at Newgate is to invite its shadow into your heart, and once it's in there, you never truly get warm again." But it was hard not to look. The prison loomed over the street like a gargoyle. Every clink of a chain or rattle of a heavy key behind those walls sent a shiver through the girls. In Victorian London, justice was swift and often blind to the belly's hunger. A stolen loaf of bread could lead to the treadmill. A lifted handkerchief could mean 7 years in the colonies, or worse, the short, sharp drop of the hangman's rope. Suddenly, a commotion broke out near the Old Bailey. A group of Charlies, the city watchmen, were dragging a young boy toward the prison gates. He couldn't have been more than 10. His face was a mask of terror, his bare feet dragging through the slush and horse manure. "I didn't do it! I swear on me mother's grave!" the boy shrieked. His voice was a piercing needle in the thick air. A pickpocket or a dip, it didn't matter what they called him. The watchman didn't listen. He simply tightened his grip on the boy's collar, his knuckles white with the casual cruelty of the law. Eliza felt the silver shilling tucked inside her boot. It felt like a hot coal against her skin, a heavy, burning weight. If she were searched, if a constable decided her face looked suspicious, that shilling would be her ticket to the dark. To be a girl with money you couldn't prove you earned was to be a thief in the eyes of the magistrate. "Walk faster," Eliza commanded, her hand tightening on Nell's arm until it hurt. They ducked into a narrow, winding alleyway known as Thief's Corner. Here, the shadow of Newgate was replaced by the shadow of the underworld. If the law was the iron hand, the pickpockets were the ghost fingers. The alley was filled with artful dodgers in the making, boys and girls who lived by the rule of the light touch. They stood in the doorways, their eyes scanning the crowds like hawks for the bulge of a watch pocket or the glint of a silver coin. They were the predators of the fog, yet they were as much victims as the boy being dragged to the gate. "Liza, look at that man," Nell whispered, pointing toward a gentleman in a thick wool coat who had mistakenly wandered too far from the main thoroughfare. He was a swell, rich, oblivious, and smelling of lavender. Behind him, 2 shadows were moving. They didn't walk, they drifted. One was a girl no older than Eliza, her hands buried in a tattered muff to hide her movements. "She's going for the wipe," Eliza noted, her breath catching in her throat. The girl moved with the grace of a cat, a sudden accidental stumble, a quick apology, and the gentleman's silk handkerchief was gone. It was a masterpiece of motion. But before the girl could vanish into the mist, a whistle pierced the air, sharp and jagged. "Police! Stop that girl!" The scene exploded. The gentleman roared, the girl bolted, and the heavy rhythmic thud of the constable's boots began to echo against the brick walls. "Run, Nell!" Eliza shouted. They didn't run because they were guilty. They ran because in the shadow of Newgate there was no such thing as an innocent bystander. To be near a crime was to be part of it. They scrambled over crates of rotting turnips, ducked under a drayman's cart, and didn't stop until the smell of the prison was replaced by the familiar stench of the fish wharves. They collapsed against a wooden piling, gasping for air. Their lungs burned from the sulfur and the exertion. "Did she get away?" Nell asked, her voice trembling. "Maybe today," Eliza said, her eyes reflecting the gray, uncaring sky. "But Newgate is patient. It doesn't need to catch you today. It just waits for you to be tired to be careful. The law in this city is like the tide. It always comes back to swallow the ones at the bottom." Eliza looked at her hands. They were shaking, not from the cold, but from the realization of how fragile her life was. The fear of the law was a permanent companion for the market girls, a ghost that sat on their shoulders every time they sold a bruised apple or carried a heavy crate. "Eliza, will we ever be safe from it?" Nell asked, her eyes filled with the haunting image of the boy at the gate. Eliza reached into her boot and touched the silver shilling. It was still there, her hope, her escape. "In America," Eliza said, her voice turning into a vow, "they say the law is written for everyone, not just the men in silk hats. We'll get there, Nell. We'll get to a place where we don't have to fear the sound of a whistle or the shadow of a stone wall." But as the morning chimes of St. Sepulchre began to ring, the bell traditionally signaling an execution, the sound felt like a cold hammer against her heart. The shadow of Newgate was long, and for now, it still owned the streets and the souls of London. Eliza stood up, wiped the soot from her face, and picked up her empty basket. She had to keep moving, because in this city, if you stopped moving, the shadow finally caught you.
Stitched by candlelight. The second shift. For the girls of the London markets, the end of the day was merely the beginning of the night. When the sun dipped below the soot-stained horizon and the apple crates were finally stacked, a different kind of labor began. This was the second shift, the grueling world of the needle and the thread. They called it the sweat trade, and in the damp, crowded attics of East London, it consumed what little was left of their youth. Eliza sat on the edge of a sagging cot in a room no larger than a horse's stall. Beside her, a single tallow candle flickered, its weak, yellow light struggling against the encroaching shadows. The air was thick with the smell of scorched fabric, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of the needle. "My eyes, they feel like they've been rubbed with sand," Nell whispered. She was hunched over a pile of black silk, her fingers moving with a frantic, desperate rhythm. "Don't close them," Eliza warned, her own needle piercing a piece of heavy wool. "We've worked 6 hours already. We can't afford to lose a single farthing now." In Victorian London, the market girls were the ultimate side hustlers. Selling fruit in the rain was never enough to cover the rent, the coal, and the bread. So they stitched. They stitched shirts for gentlemen they would never meet. They embroidered silk for ladies who would never look them in the eye. They were the invisible fingers behind the finery of the empire. Stitch, pull, snip, repeat. The rhythm was hypnotic and deadly. In the silence of the room, the only sound was the rhythmic scritch-scritch of the thread passing through the cloth. "Liza," Nell said, her voice trembling, "the candle is getting low. If it goes out before we finish the sleeves, he won't pay us for the whole garment." Eliza looked at the candle. It was a dip, the cheapest kind, made of animal fat that hissed and spat. It was melting into a pool of translucent grease. "Then we stitch faster now. Don't think about the light. Think about the needle. Feel the fabric. If you can feel the seam, you don't need to see it." But Eliza's own fingers were stiffening. The cold in the attic was a sharp, biting thing that seemed to settle in the joints. Her knuckles were swollen, her fingertips a graveyard of tiny red needle pricks. Every time she pushed the needle through the thick wool, a dull ache radiated up her arm. This was the sweatshop culture, a world where time was measured not in hours, but in stitches. A dozen shirts for a shilling, 100 buttons for a penny. It was a race against the sun, against the candle, and against the crushing weight of exhaustion. Suddenly, Nell let out a small, sharp cry. A drop of bright crimson blood bloomed on the white lace she was working on. It looked like a tiny, macabre flower in the candlelight. "Oh no! Eliza! The lace! I've ruined it!" Nell's voice broke into a sob. A blood stain meant the garment was damaged. In the cruel economy of the sweat trade, a damaged garment didn't just mean no pay. It meant a fine that could put a girl in debt for a month. "Hush," Eliza said, grabbing a scrap of damp rag. "Quickly, before it sets." She scrubbed the fabric with a cold, ruthless efficiency. Her heart hammered against her ribs. If the master tailor saw this, they would be out on the street by morning. "It's coming out, Nell. See? The light is so dim he won't notice unless you keep crying and make the thread wet with tears." Nell wiped her eyes with her sleeve, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Why is it so hard, Liza? We sell the food, but we go hungry. We sew the clothes, but we stay in rags. Does the world ever stop taking?" Eliza didn't answer immediately. She looked at the blood-stained rag in her hand. She thought of the upstairs world she had seen, the silk dresses that were worn once and then discarded. She thought of the silver shilling still tucked in her boot. "The world only takes what you let it now. That's why we save. That's why we work the second shift. Every stitch we pull is a stitch closer to the docks. Every hour of this hell is a minute of freedom in the West." The candle gave one final desperate flare and then died. The room was plunged into an absolute suffocating darkness. The smell of the burnt wick lingered in the air like a ghost. But the girls didn't stop. They couldn't. Eliza felt for the needle in the dark. She felt the cold, sharp point against her thumb. She found the edge of the wool, the familiar texture of the seam. Stitch, pull, snip, repeat. They worked in the pitch black, guided only by the muscle memory of 1,000 nights. They were the shadows of London, stitching the dreams of the rich with the blood and sweat of the poor. "Eliza," whispered Nell into the blackness. "I'm here, Nell. Keep your hands moving. The sun will be up in 3 hours, and then we have to be back at Covent Garden for the violets." "I'm moving, Liza. I'm moving." In the silence of the attic, the ghost sound of the needles continued. They were tired, they were hungry, and their eyes were blind with exhaustion, but they were alive. And in the heart of the Victorian night, that was the only victory they had. Sisterhood of the Stall, the unspoken vow. The London wind didn't just blow, it bit. It was a cold that traveled through the layers of wool, through the skin, and settled deep within the marrow of the bone. On the corner of Bow Street, where the mud was thickest and the shadows of the police court loomed like giants, the sisterhood was forming. In the world of the market, a girl alone was a girl lost, but a girl with her stall sisters was a force that even the city could not break. Eliza stood at her usual post, her hands tucked into her armpits for a ghost of warmth. Beside her, a single one-eyed Mary, who had lost her sight to a stray spark from a blacksmith's forge, and little Pip, a child of 9, who could outsell any grown man in the district. "The wind is coming from the east today," Mary remarked, her head tilted as if listening to the air itself. "That means the river smell will be heavy, and the gentlemen will be in a hurry. They won't stop for a chat. They'll only stop if we block their path." "Then we block 'em," Pip chirped, her teeth chattering like castanets. This was the unspoken bond. In the Victorian class system, these girls were the unreachables, the surplus population. But here, on this specific patch of wet cobblestones, they were a family. They didn't share blood, but they shared something stronger. They shared the hunger, the cold, and the fierce protective loyalty of the hunted. "Eliza," Mary whispered, her voice low and urgent, "don't look now, but the shark is circling." The shark was Mr. Grimes, a rent collector for the cellar dwellings. He was a man with a heart like a cold cinder, known for taking a girl's last copper or throwing her bedding into the muck if she was a farthing short. He was walking toward little Pip, his heavy cane tapping a rhythm of dread against the stones. Pip froze. Her basket of watercress was still nearly full. She hadn't made her rent. "Hide her," Eliza commanded. Without a second word, the sisterhood moved. It was a practiced, silent maneuver. Mary stepped to the left. Her large, bulky frame created a wall of shadow. Eliza stepped forward, holding out a tray of apples to block Grimes's line of sight. They created a cocoon of ragged fabric around the child.
"Evening, Mr. Grimes," Eliza shouted, her voice bright and brittle. "A crisp apple for a man of your standing. On the house, sir, to keep the winter humors away." Grimes stopped, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the corner. He knew they were hiding something. He could smell the fear. But the sisterhood was a solid front. "I'm not here for fruit, girl. I'm here for the brat. She owes for 2 nights in the rookery." "She's not here, sir," Mary lied, her sightless eye staring straight through him. "Went to the wharves an hour ago. Said she had a cousin with a lead on some spice work." Grimes lingered. The tension was a vibrating wire between them. Eliza felt her heart thumping against her ribs. She knew that if he pushed past her, the game was up. But she didn't move. She stood her ground, her chin tilted up in a gesture of defiance that she had learned from 1,000 cold mornings. Finally, with a grunt of disgust, Grimes moved on. "Tell her I'll have the coppers by midnight, or she sleeps in the Thames." The moment he was out of earshot, the girls exhaled. It was a collective sound, a release of the pressure that kept them upright. Pip emerged from behind Mary's skirts, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and gratitude. "Thank you, Liza. Thank you, Mary," the child whispered. "Don't thank us," Eliza said, her voice turning firm. "Just sell the cress. And you," she turned to Mary, "take her to the coffee stall later. I've got a spare penny for a hot mug. She needs the steam in her lungs." This was the economy of the sisterhood. They didn't have banks, they had each other. When one girl's voice failed from the cold, another sang her cries. When one girl's boots fell apart, another shared her rags. It was a socialism of the gutter, a fierce, desperate love that the upstairs world could never comprehend. They lived by a code: never steal from a sister, never tell the beetle a name, always leave a crust for the one who has nothing. As the gaslight began to flicker in the encroaching fog, the girls huddled closer. They shared stories, not of the misery they were in, but of the golden dreams they held. Mary spoke of a cottage in Kent where the air didn't taste of coal. Pip spoke of a doll with real porcelain hands. And Eliza spoke of the ship. "We're all going, aren't we, Liza?" Pip asked, clutching a wilted bunch of cress. "To the place across the water?" Eliza looked at her sisters. She looked at Mary's scarred face and Pip's trembling hands. She knew the statistics. She knew that half the girls on this corner wouldn't survive the winter. The wasting cough or the black fever would claim them, or the streets would simply grind them into the mud. But she didn't say that. "We're going," Eliza vowed, her voice ringing out over the noise of the passing carriages. "Every one of us. We'll find a corner in the New World where the sun stays out all day, and we'll have a stall made of gold, and we'll sell nothing but joy." The girls laughed. It was a thin, rattling sound, but it was real. For a few minutes, the hunger didn't hurt as much. The cold didn't feel as sharp. They were the sisterhood of the stall, the unloved, the unwanted, and the unbroken. "Apples!" Eliza screamed, her voice finding a new, fierce strength. "Apples for the sisters! Apples for the soul!" Beside her, Mary and Pip joined in. Their voices rose together, a discordant, beautiful choir of survival, echoing through the dark, indifferent streets of London. They were shadows in the fog, but together they were a light that the darkness could not put out. The merchant's greed,
the toll of the iron gate. The market was not governed by the sun nor by the law, but by the ledger. Behind every crate of wilted greens and every basket of bruised fruit stood the middlemen, men with soft hands and hard hearts who sat in the shadows of the counting houses. They were the merchants of hunger, the men who owned the goods before they reached the stalls and owned the girls before they could even earn a farthing. Eliza stood before the iron-grilled window of Mr. Sterling. Sterling was the wholesale king of the South Row. He was a man who smelled of expensive snuff and cold sweat, and he controlled the flow of apples into Covent Garden like a king controlling a water supply during a drought. "The price has tripled since Tuesday, Mr. Sterling," Eliza said. Her voice was a low, steady thrum against the iron bars. "My girls can't sell a bag of pips for a penny if the crate costs us a shilling. We're not making a profit, we're just paying for the privilege of starving." Inside the office, Sterling didn't even look up from his heavy, leather-bound book. The scratching of his quill was the only sound in the room, a sharp, rhythmic scritch-scritch that sounded like a rat gnawing on bone. "Supply and demand, my girl," Sterling remarked, his voice as smooth as oil and twice as slick. "The frost in Kent has killed the orchards. If you want the fruit, you pay the price. If you cannot pay, there are 50 other girls in the mud who will sell their shawls to take your spot." Eliza gripped the iron bars until her knuckles turned the color of the fog. She knew that the supply was not dead. She had seen the crates. She had seen the warehouses at the docks, overflowing with barrels of jennetings and russets, held back by men like Sterling to artificially drive the prices higher. This was the middleman's greed, a calculated cruelty that squeezed the blood out of the market girls to turn it into gold for the gentry. "You're hoarding the fruit, sir," Eliza whispered, the accusation hanging in the damp air between them. "I saw the wagons last night. You're waiting for the prices to peak while the children on Bow Street go without a bite. It's not business, sir. It's murder." The quill stopped. Sterling looked up. His eyes were pale, watery, and completely devoid of empathy. He looked at Eliza as if she were a broken tool that was no longer efficient. "Murder is a legal term, Eliza. This is merely commerce," Sterling said. He stood up, his belly straining against his silk vestment. "You speak of your girls as if you are their queen, but remember, I am the one who provides the stage. Without me, you are just a beggar. Now, either pay the 3 shillings for the morning load, or move along. You're blocking the light." Eliza felt a surge of white-hot rage, a fire that threatened to consume the market mask she had worn for years. She thought of Nell, whose boots were now held together by nothing but string. She thought of One-Eyed Mary, who hadn't had a hot meal in 4 days. 3 shillings, Eliza repeated, her voice shaking with the weight of the injustice. "That is the price of a life in this city. You take our sweat, you take our breath, and now you want our very blood." "I want my profit," Sterling snapped. Eliza reached into her boot. The silver shilling, her golden dream money, felt heavy. It was a week's hope, saved for the ship, saved for the West. To give it to Sterling was to surrender a piece of her future to a man who already had everything. She looked at the crates behind the office, stacks of wood that held the sustenance of London. She realized then that the merchant's greed was not just about the money, it was about the control. By keeping them hungry, he kept them obedient. By keeping them poor, he kept them on their knees. "Take it," Eliza said. She didn't hand him the coin, she threw it. The silver shilling hit the mahogany desk with a sharp, echoing clink and rolled until it hit the inkwell. Sterling didn't flinch. He picked up the coin, bit it to check the metal, and nodded towards the door. "Crate number 4, and don't let me catch you scrounging from the fallen bins again, or I'll have the beadle bar you from the row entirely." Eliza stepped out into the roar of the market. The fog was thick, but the clarity in her mind was sharper than it had ever been. She walked to crate number 4 and began to haul it towards her stall. The wood was rough,
splinters piercing her palms, but she didn't feel the pain. She realized that you couldn't beat a man like Sterling by playing his game. You couldn't out-negotiate the man who owned the table. "Liza, did you get them?" Nell asked, her eyes wide as Eliza arrived with the fruit. "I got them," Eliza said, her voice different now, harder, colder. "But we paid more than silver, Nell. We paid with time we'll never get back." "How will we make the rent now?" Nell whispered, seeing the empty pouch at Eliza's waist. Eliza looked at the apples. They were beautiful, red and glowing, but to her, they looked like the faces of the men who sold them. "We're not going to make the rent by selling these one by one now," Eliza said. "We're going to change the way the market works. If Sterling wants to squeeze us, we'll find a way to squeeze back."
This was the turning point. The merchant's greed had finally pushed the girl of the mist too far. The confrontation had not broken her, it had forged her. As she polished an apple with a scrap of her apron, she wasn't just preparing for the morning trade. She was preparing for a war. A war between the people who owned the goods and the people who owned the grit. "Apples!" Eliza cried out. The sound was a battle cry that cut through the sulfur and the noise. "Apples for the hungry! Come and buy before the merchants take the sun itself!" Beside her, the other girls picked up the cry. It was a chorus of the exploited, a rising tide of voices that echoed against the iron-grilled windows of the counting houses. The merchants were in their offices, counting their golden gains, but outside, the girls of the market were starting to count the cost, and the cost was coming due. Voices in the mist, the language of the hidden. The fog was not just a shroud, it was a wall of silence. But for those born in the gutters of Covent Garden, that silence was a canvas. In the Victorian era, the law spoke in the king's English, sharp, formal, and cold. But the market girls, they spoke in flash. It was a unique, jagged slang, a secret tongue woven from backslang, rhyming cant, and the desperate necessity of staying one step ahead of the crushers, the police. Eliza stood at the corner of Maiden Lane, her eyes scanning the shifting gray mist. Beside her, Nell was trying to sell a few wilted bundles of watercress to a passing clerk. "Stow it, Nell," Eliza whispered suddenly, her voice low and sharp. "The blue bottle is on the drag. He's looking for a squeeze." Immediately, Nell pulled her basket back. To an outsider, Eliza's words were gibberish, but to Nell, it was a vital warning. "Shut up. A policeman is on the street, and he's looking for a bribe or an arrest." This was the voices in the mist, the linguistic armor of the poor. If the girls spoke plainly, the authorities would hear their plans, their locations, and their hunger. But through flash talk, the market became a network of invisible signals. "Is he a shark or just a pigeon?" Nell asked, her voice trembling slightly. "A shark," Eliza replied, her fingers nervously playing with the silver shilling in her boot. "He's got a narc with him. They're looking for the girls who took the spice scrap from the wharves." The flash was more than just words. It was a rhythm. It was a way of claiming a world that tried to deny them a voice. When a girl called a shilling a bob or a 5-pound note a finnip, she was speaking a language the upstairs world couldn't regulate. It was a secret sisterhood of sound. Suddenly, a tall, broad-shouldered constable emerged from the fog. His brass buttons caught the dim light of a nearby gas lamp, looking like the eyes of a predator. He looked at Eliza and Nell with a gaze that stripped them of their humanity. "Move along, you two," the constable barked. "No loitering. The street is for transit, not for your filth." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir," Eliza said, her voice perfectly submissive, the picture of a humble market girl. But as the constable turned his back, Eliza caught the eye of tall Martha across the street. She didn't wave, she didn't point. She simply whistled a short 3-note bird call and shouted, "Hey, Martha, the nose is mucking the dabs at the Holy Land." The constable didn't blink. He thought Eliza was just shouting nonsense to a friend. But in the secret language of the market, the message was a fire alarm. The police informer is searching the lodgings at the Seven Dials Rookery.
Within seconds, the message traveled. A flower girl at the next corner repeated the bird call. A mudlark by the river picked it up. Through the mist, the voices echoed, a chain of sound that the law couldn't break. Before the constable could even reach the end of the block, every underground girl in the district knew exactly where the danger was. "That's the beauty of it, isn't it?" Eliza whispered to Nell as they ducked into a side alley. "They think they own the streets because they have the batons, but we own the air. We speak between the words." But flash talk was also a way of preserving their dreams. When the girls talked about America, they didn't use the name of the country. They called it the Big Blue Pasture. It was a way to keep the hope safe, a way to make sure the merchant's greed or the beetle's cane couldn't find their secret ambitions and crush them. "One day," Nell said, practicing the slang with a small, defiant smile, "we'll be the swans on the big blue pasture. No more grubbing for browns in the muck." "We will," Eliza promised. As the night deepened and the voices in the mist grew more frequent, Eliza felt a strange sense of power. They were poor, they were hungry, and they were hunted, but they were not silent. Their language was a living thing, a rebellious song that rose from the gutters and filled the Victorian night. Every scritch of a needle in a sweatshop, every cry of apples in the morning, and every whispered flash in the dark was a brick in the wall they were building against the world. They were the girls who woke the city, and they were the only ones who truly knew its secrets. "Listen now." Eliza tilted her head as the distant rhythmic chanting of the costermongers began to rise. "Can you hear it? That's not just noise. That's us. That's the city's heart beating, and it beats in our tongue." The fog swallowed their figures, but their voices remained, cutting through the sulfur, defying the gaslight, and carrying the hope of 1,000 market girls toward the dawn. A penny for your thoughts, the hunger of the mind. In the markets of London, hunger was usually a matter of the stomach. It was a sharp physical demand for bread, for suet, for anything to stop the shivering. But for Eliza, there was a second kind of hunger, one that was perhaps more dangerous because it couldn't be satisfied by a stolen apple. It was the hunger of the mind. In a world where a girl was valued only for the strength of her back, the ability to read was a secret weapon, a small flickering candle in a city of absolute intellectual darkness. Eliza sat in the corner of a damp cellar, a discarded newspaper spread across her knees. The paper was stained with fish oil and mud. The ink was smudged where someone had stepped on it, but to Eliza it was more precious than silk. "What does it say, Liza?" Nell whispered, her eyes wide as she watched Eliza's finger trace a jagged line of black type. "It says opportunity," Eliza whispered, her tongue stumbling over the 4 syllables. "It says new lands await the brave." For the market girls, literacy was a rare and stolen treasure. There were no schools for the morning stars. Their education was the street. Their teachers were the merchants and the beetles. To yearn for a book was seen by the upstairs world as a waste of time, or worse, a sign of rebellion. A girl who could read was a girl who could think, and a girl who could think was a girl who might realize her own worth. "Teach me a word," Nell pleaded, leaning in. "Just one, so I can see it when I walk past the shop signs." Eliza looked at the paper. She found a word with 5 letters. "This one," she said, pointing. H-O-P-E. Hope. It starts with a breath, like a sigh, and ends with a click of the teeth. Nell repeated it, her voice a tiny vibration in the cold room. Hope. It looks small on the paper, doesn't it, for something that feels so heavy in the chest. This was the penny for your thoughts reality, while the wealthy children of the West End sat in warm nurseries with leather-bound primers. Eliza and her sisters scavenged for knowledge in the gutters. They read the names on the crates. They deciphered the handbills pasted on the brick walls. They listened to the street preachers and the ballad sellers, memorizing the structure of sentences as if they were maps to a hidden treasure. "Liza," Nell said suddenly, her voice turning serious. "Why do you want it so bad? The reading. It won't make the baskets lighter. It won't make the fog go away." Eliza looked up from the stained newspaper. Her eyes were fierce, reflecting the orange glow of the embers in the hearth. "Because now, if you can't read, they can tell you anything. They can tell you that you're worth nothing. They can tell you that the law is fair when it isn't. But if you can read, you can see the world for yourself. You can read the ship schedules. You can read the contracts. You can find the way out." The yearning for education was a quiet riot. It happened in the moments between the work. A girl would trace letters in the soot on a window pane. Another would use a piece of charcoal to write her name on a wooden stall. It was a way of saying, "I am here. I exist. I have a name that can be written." Suddenly, the cellar door creaked open. It was Mrs. Gable, the mistress of the lodging house, a woman who viewed books with the same suspicion she viewed a plague rat. "Wasting candles on paper again, are ya?" she croaked, her shadow stretching across the wall like a looming threat. "Paper don't fill the belly, Eliza. It only fills the head with nonsense that makes you lazy at the stall. Burn it. The heth needs the heat more than you need the words." Eliza didn't argue. She knew the cost of defiance. But as she handed the newspaper to the flames, she didn't feel defeated. She had already memorized the word. She had tucked hope away in the same place she kept the silver shilling, in the secret vault of her mind, where no merchant or beetle could ever reach. "The paper is gone, Mrs. Gable," Eliza said, her voice perfectly calm. "But the words, they don't burn so easy."
As the newspaper curled into black ash, Eliza watched the letters vanish. But in the darkness of the cellar, she could still see them. She realized that education was the ultimate side hustle. It was the one thing the city couldn't tax, and the one thing the merchant couldn't take back. "Tomorrow," Eliza whispered to Nell as they huddled together for sleep, "we'll find a new paper, and I'll teach you freedom. It's a longer word, but it's worth the breath." The chimes of London rang out for the midnight hour, a cold, mechanical sound. But in the mind of a 15-year-old girl in the mud, there was a new sound. It was the sound of a page turning. It was the sound of a mind waking up. And in the Victorian night, that was the most dangerous sound of all. The winter's teeth, the white hunger. The fog had changed. It was no longer a yellow, sulphurous blanket. It had turned into something sharp, translucent, and crystalline. The London ivy had frozen. In the markets of Covent Garden, they called this time the white hunger. It was when the dampness of the Thames didn't just chill the skin, it bit into it. The frost was not a season, it was an animal, a silent, starving predator with winter's teeth that began to gnaw at the city's poorest. Eliza woke before the chimes, but not because of her internal clock. She woke because the condensation from her own breath had turned to a thin sheet of ice on the ragged blanket. "Nell," Eliza whispered, her voice sounding like the cracking of dry glass. "Nell, wake up! Don't let the sleep take you too deep. If you get too cold while you dream, you won't feel the moment your heart decides to stop." Nell stirred beside her, her body curled into a ball so tight she looked like a frozen bird. Her skin was no longer pale, it was a sickly, translucent blue. This was the dead cold, the stage where the body stops fighting and starts to surrender. In the Victorian winter, warmth was a currency more valuable than gold. A shovelful of coal was worth a day's labor. A dry pair of rags was worth a week's hope. For the market girls, the struggle was no longer about selling fruit, it was about maintaining a temperature that allowed for life. "The stones are white, Liza," Nell said, her teeth chattering with a rhythmic, mechanical sound. "Look, the mud has turned to bone." They stepped out of the cellar and into the street. The air didn't feel like air, it felt like needles. Every breath was a small agony in the lungs, a reminder that the atmosphere itself was now hostile to the living. The gutters, usually flowing with the filth of the city, were now silent, locked in a jagged, frozen stasis. "We need a fire, Penny," Eliza said, her fingers numb inside her fingerless gloves. "If we can't get a hot coal from the braziers, we won't last the morning shift." They moved toward the market center, where the drayman had lit a small fire in an iron bucket. A group of girls were already huddled around the glow, their hands stretched out toward the orange glow. But it wasn't enough. The heat only touched the palms. The back of the neck remained in the grip of the frost. "Look at tall Martha," Nell whispered, nodding toward a girl leaning against a stone pillar. Martha wasn't moving. She was standing upright, her basket of frozen violets still clutched in her hand. But her eyes were fixed on a point in the distance that didn't exist. There was a thin layer of hoarfrost on her eyelashes. "Martha?" Eliza stepped forward, her heart sinking. She touched Martha's shoulder. The girl didn't flinch. She was as cold as the pillar she leaned against. The winter's teeth had found her in the night, biting softly, numbing the pain, until she simply drifted from the world of the hungry to the world of the silent. "She's gone, Nell," Eliza said, her voice devoid of emotion, not because she didn't care, but because grief was a luxury that required energy she didn't have. "Don't look at her eyes. Just look at the fire." This was the brutal reality of the white hunger. Every morning, the death carts would roam the alleys, picking up the winter drops, the homeless, the elderly, and the market girls who had reached the end of their endurance. The city of London, the heart of the greatest empire on earth, watched them freeze with a cold, mechanical indifference. As the day progressed, the frost didn't melt. The sun was a pale, heatless ghost behind the smoke clouds. The apples in Eliza's basket were useless. They had frozen through, turning into hard, tasteless stones. "How do we sell ice, Liza?" Nell asked, her voice fading. "We don't," Eliza replied, her mind racing. "We go to the wharves, the steam engines, the boilers. We find the heat where the machines live." They spent the afternoon huddled near the back of a laundry house, where the hot exhaust from the steam presses offered a temporary humid salvation. The air was thick with the smell of soap and wet wool, but it was warm. For an hour, the blue tint left Nell's fingernails. For an hour, Eliza could feel her toes again. But the warmth was a tease. The moment they stepped back into the street, the frost hit twice as hard. It felt as if the frost was angry that they had escaped its grip. "I can't feel my legs, Liza," Nell stumbled on the white cobblestones. "Everything is so quiet, like the world is made of wool." Eliza grabbed her, pulling Nell's arm over her shoulder. "Walk! You have to walk, Nell. Think of the ship. Think of the big blue pasture where the sun never goes out. If you stop now, you'll end up like Martha. You'll be a statue in the mud." They struggled back towards their cellar, two small dark shapes in a world of blinding frozen white. The chimes of the city rang out, sounding muffled and distant, as if the sound itself was freezing in the air. When they finally reached their damp corner, Eliza did something she had never done before. She took the America handbill, the scrap of paper that held her entire future, and she crumpled it. "Liza, no," Nell gasped. "It's paper, Nell. It's fuel." With a trembling hand, Eliza struck a single precious match. The handbill caught fire. For 30 seconds, a small, bright flame danced in the darkness of the cellar. It was a tiny fire, but it was theirs. They hovered over it, breathing in the smoke of their dreams, using the very thing they hoped for to survive the night. As the last ember of the paper died out, the darkness returned, colder and heavier than before. But the winter's teeth hadn't won. Not tonight. "We're still here," Eliza whispered into the dark, her hand finding Nell's in the shadows. In the distance, the wind howled through the empty stalls of Covent Garden, a lonely, hungry sound. But inside the cellar, two girls remained, huddled together against the white hunger, waiting for a sun that felt 1,000 years away. Chapter 15. Feasts of the Imagination, the Architecture of Hunger. In the heart of Victorian London, hunger was not a silent void. It was a loud, demanding presence. But for the girls of the market, there was a way to fight the emptiness that didn't involve a single crust of bread. They called it fancy eating. It was a psychological survival tactic, a feast constructed entirely of words, memories, and the sheer power of longing. When the stomach is empty, the imagination becomes a gourmet. Eliza and Nell sat on the frozen edge of a stone fountain, their shadows long and thin under the flickering gaslight. It had been 24 hours since they had shared a dry biscuit. The white hunger was gnawing at them. But Eliza began to speak, her voice weaving a tapestry of gold in the gray mist. "Close your eyes, Nell," Eliza commanded, her voice dropping into a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. "Stop looking at the mud. Tell me, what is on the table tonight at the mansion in the square?" Nell closed her eyes, her eyelids fluttering with exhaustion. A roast beef, Liza. Bigger as a carriage wheel." "No, bigger," Eliza corrected, leaning in as if she could smell the phantom aroma. "It's a rib of beef crusted with salt and black pepper. The fat is rendered down until it's as crisp as a winter leaf and as dark as mahogany. When the butler carves it, sure, the steam rises up in a cloud that smells of the English countryside. It's sitting in a lake of gravy, a deep, rich brown sea that's so thick you could swim in it. And the potatoes?" Nell whispered, her hands moving as if she were holding a ghostly fork. "They're roasted in the dripping, Nell. They're gold on the outside, like little nuggets of sun. And when you bite through that crunch, the inside is like a cloud. It's pure, white, fluffy snow that melts on your tongue. And beside them, there are carrots glazed in honey, not the woody carrots from the bins, but young, sweet ones that taste like the first day of spring."
In the psychology of the poor, this was counter-reality. By describing the textures, the temperatures, and the specific flavors of luxury, they were reclaiming a dignity that the world had stolen from them. They weren't just beggars, they were connoisseurs of the impossible. "Tell me about the pudding, Liza," Nell pleaded, her voice a tiny thread of hope in the dark. "The pudding is a plum duff, but not like the ones the sailors eat," Eliza said, her eyes fixed on the darkness as if she were reading a menu written in the stars. "It's heavy with currants that have been soaked in brandy for a month. It's dark, spicy, and steaming hot. They pour a custard over it, a thick yellow cream that's so sweet it makes your throat ache. It's the kind of heat that starts in your chest and moves all the way down to your frozen toes." Suddenly, the illusion was shattered. A heavy carriage rattled past, splashing icy slush onto Eliza's boots. The smell of horse manure and coal smoke rushed back, choking the phantom scent of roasted beef. "It's gone," Nell sobbed, opening her eyes to the gray reality of the street. "It was just words, Liza. I'm still empty. It hurts worse now." Eliza grabbed Nell's hands, rubbing them fiercely. "No, it's not just words, Nell. If you can imagine it, you can own a piece of it. The merchants own the food, but they don't own the taste. They eat because they have to. We eat because we dream. Which one of us is more alive?" This was the tragedy of the Victorian era. A city that sat on top of the world's wealth allowed its own daughters to survive on the scraps of a dream. But the psychological study of this longing reveals a terrifying strength. The girls didn't just want to eat, they wanted to be the kind of people who were allowed to eat. As the night deepened, the feasts of the imagination continued in cellars and attics across London. Thousands of girls, huddled together, were building banquets out of the air. They were describing oranges that tasted like fire and bread that was as soft as a mother's kiss. "One more, Liza," Nell whispered, her head leaning against Eliza's shoulder. "Tell me about the tea." "The tea is served in cups so thin you can see the light through them," Eliza said, her voice fading as sleep finally began to pull at her. It's hot, and it has so much sugar in it that it feels like liquid gold. No more mud, Nell, no more mist, just the gold and the warmth and the rest. In the silence that followed, the hunger remained, but the spirit had been fed. They were the hungry dreamers of London, and their imagination was the only feast the empire couldn't take away. The doctor's shadow, the breath of the Blue Death. The fog had changed its character once again. It was no longer just cold, it was heavy with a sweet, cloying scent of decay. In the rookeries of Spitalfields and the crowded stalls of the market, a new shadow had arrived, one that moved faster than the beetle and more silent than the frost. They called it the Blue Death. Cholera had come to London, and in its wake, the doctor's shadow stretched long over the cobbles, marking those who would not see the next dawn. Eliza stood at the entrance of their cellar, her hand pressed against the damp stone. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of vinegar and burnt lavender, the desperate defenses of the poor. Nell lay on the cot, her skin turning a ghostly, translucent gray. This wasn't the white hunger of the winter. This was the blue fire of the fever. "Liza, my throat, it's like I've swallowed the river dust," Nell whispered. Her voice was a dry rattle, like dead leaves skittering over pavement. "Don't speak now. Save your breath," Eliza commanded, though her own heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. In the Victorian era, for a market girl, the real doctor was a myth, a man in a top hat who only visited the houses with marble steps and silk curtains. For the people of the mud, the only medicine was grassroots medicine. It was a mixture of folklore, desperation, and the bitter herbs sold by the wise women of the alleys. Eliza reached for a small chipped ceramic bowl. Inside was a dark, pungent liquid, a healer's brew made of crushed garlic, pennyroyal, and a dash of laudanum she had traded her last silver shilling for. "Drink this," Eliza said, lifting Nell's head with a tenderness that defied the harshness of their lives. "It's the old mother's cure. It tastes of the earth, but it's the only thing that stands between you and the shadow." The doctor's shadow was a psychological terror. When the red cross was painted on a door, or the black cart began its slow, rhythmic patrol, the community of the market didn't look for help from the hospitals. They knew those were places where the poor went to be forgotten. Instead, they turned to each other. They shared secret recipes of vinegar of the four thieves. They tied pouches of camphor around their necks, and they whispered prayers to saints the church had long since ignored. Stir, sip, pray, repeat. The night deepened, and the sounds from the street outside became more frequent. The heavy, mechanical thud of the body catcher's cart, the distant, haunting wail of a mother in the next court, and the constant, rhythmic coughing that served as the city's new heartbeat. "Why don't they come for us, Liza?" Nell asked, her eyes dilated and glazed. "The men in the fine coats, why do they only watch from the bridges?" "Because to them, the fever is a broom, Nell." Eliza turned, her voice turning into a low, fierce growl of realization. "They think it cleans the streets of the unwanted. They don't see the morning stars, they only see the surplus. But they're wrong. We're not the dust, we're the stone." This was the grassroots survival. While the elite debated sanitation in Parliament, the market girls were practicing a crude, effective chemistry. Eliza used hot bricks wrapped in wool to keep Nell's circulation moving. She used boiled river water, filtered through a rag and a layer of cartrol, to wash the fever from Nell's brow. It was science born of necessity, a battle for life, fought with the debris of the city. Suddenly, a knock sounded at the door, not a polite knock, but a heavy, official thud. "Health inspectors, open up in the name of the parish." Eliza froze. She knew what that meant. If they found Nell in this state, they would take her to the fever sheds, and no one ever came back from the sheds. "Hide her," Eliza whispered to herself. She threw a pile of empty apple sacks over Nell, then stood in front of the cot, her arms crossed, her face a mask of defiant health.
When the door creaked open, 2 men entered. They wore masks filled with herbs and carried long wooden poles to avoid touching the contagion. They looked like monsters from a nightmare, their eyes peering through thick glass lenses. "Any sickness here, girl?" the first man asked, his voice muffled by the mask. "No sickness, sir," Eliza lied, her voice as steady as the granite walls. "Just the exhaustion of the work. My sister is sleeping off a double shift at the laundry." The men looked around the damp, miserable cellar. They saw the burnt lavender and the bowl of herbs. They knew that Dr. Shadow was here. They could smell it, but they were tired and they were afraid. They didn't want to find the fever in a place this deep. "Keep the air moving, then," the second man grunted, "and pray the wind stays in the east. If the Blue Death takes root here, we'll wall up the whole court." They left as quickly as they had arrived. Eliza collapsed against the door, the strength leaving her legs in a sudden rush. She crawled back to Nell's cot and pulled away the sacks. Nell was still breathing, shallow, ragged breaths, but she was alive. The wise woman's brew and the heat of the bricks had held the shadow at bay for 1 more hour. "We're still here, Nell," Eliza whispered, her forehead resting against the cool skin. "The Doctor's shadow can walk the streets, but it doesn't own this cellar. Not tonight. Not ever." Outside, the bells of St. Paul's rang out, a deep funeral toll that echoed through the mist. The city was dying in the thousands, but in the heart of the darkness, a 15-year-old girl was winning a war against an empire and an invisible enemy. She wasn't just a market girl anymore. She was the guardian of the light.
And for the first time in years, Eliza saw herself. She froze. The girl in the water was a stranger. Her face was a landscape of shadows. The hollows of her cheeks were deep enough to hide secrets, and her eyes, once the bright blue of a summer morning, were now the color of the river at midnight. Her hair was a tangled nest of copper and ash, tucked under a shawl that had lost its color 1,000 rainfalls ago. "Is that you, Eliza?" she whispered, her own voice sounding like a ghost in the empty street. She knelt beside the puddle, the dampness soaking into her thin skirts, but she didn't care. She leaned closer until her breath disturbed the surface of the water, sending ripples through her reflection. In this moment, the circumstances of her life began to peel away like old wallpaper. She thought of the merchant's greed, the doctor's shadow, and the cost of a curtsy. For 15 years, the city had told her what she was: a morning star, a market girl, a scavenger, a surplus soul. Every person she met, from the butler in the square to the beadle on the row, had looked at her and seen only a tool or a nuisance. But as she stared into the mud puddle, she realized the city was a liar. The mud and the water didn't define the reflection, it only framed it. Beneath the soot on her skin, there was a jawline as sharp as any duchess's. Beneath the hunger in her eyes, there was a fire that the white hunger hadn't been able to extinguish. She wasn't just a girl of the mist, she was a girl of will. "I am more than the apples," she said, her voice growing stronger, vibrating against the still water. "I am more than the farthings. I am more than the breath I take in the dark." This was the reflection of self-discovery. In the psychology of survival, there is a moment when the victim decides to become the architect. Eliza realized that her circumstances were a cage, yes, but a cage made of iron and fog can be broken if the bird inside knows its own strength. The silver shilling in her boot wasn't just money anymore, it was a key. The flash talk wasn't just slang, it was a code of rebellion. She reached out and touched the water. The image of the market girl shattered into 1,000 liquid fragments. "They see a ghost," Eliza whispered, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face, a smile that hadn't been there since she was a child. "But ghosts don't have blood that burns. Ghosts don't have dreams that can build a world across the sea." Suddenly, the moon was swallowed by the clouds again. The reflection vanished.
leaving only the dark, oily water and the reflection of a lonely gas lamp. But Eliza didn't need the light anymore. She stood up, her back straighter than it had ever been. She didn't look like a girl who had spent the night in a damp cellar. She looked like a queen who had just rediscovered her kingdom in a gutter. She thought of Nell sleeping back in the cellar, still recovering from the fever. She thought of the sisterhood of the stall. They were all looking at the mud, but Eliza would teach them to look at the reflection. She would show them that they were not the filth of the empire. They were its foundation. And if the foundation moved, the whole empire would tremble. "The mud stays in London," Eliza vowed, stepping over the puddle and walking toward the docks. "But the girl is leaving." The chimes of the city rang out. 4 o'clock. The morning stars would be waking up now. They would be shivering, coughing, and preparing to beg for their lives, 1 penny at a time. But as Eliza walked, her hobnailed boots made a new sound on the cobblestones. It wasn't the shuffling sound of the defeated. It was the rhythmic iron beat of a soldier. She had discovered her soul in a mud puddle, and a soul that has seen itself can never be enslaved again. A bridge to tomorrow. The price of passage. The fog over the Thames was no longer a mist. It was a heavy, suffocating shroud of charcoal and salt. Below the towering spans of London Bridge, the water churned like a black liquid beast, swallowing the secrets of the city. For Eliza and Nell, this was the bridge to tomorrow. It was the place where the underground economy met the possibility of escape, and where the ultimate test of their loyalty would be written in the dark. Eliza stood at the edge of the wharf, her fingers trembling as she clutched a heavy oilskin pouch. Inside was the spice gain, the cinnamon and cloves they had risked their lives to scavenge from the docks. Beside her stood Slippery Silas, a smuggler with a face like a scarred map and a voice that sounded like shifting gravel. "1 ticket, girl," Silas said, his breath smelling of stale ale and ocean salt. "1 ticket. The ship leaves with the tide at 4. I have 1 berth left, 1 passage to the golden west, but the spice covers 1 head, not 2. The world stopped. The roar of the city, the clanging of the iron bells, and the shouting of the night watchmen all faded into a dull hum. Eliza looked at Nell. The younger girl was shivering, her thin shawl soaked through with the freezing spray of the river. Nell's eyes were filled with a terrifying mixture of hope and premonition. "1 ticket?" Eliza whispered. Her words felt like jagged glass in her throat. "1," Silas repeated, tapping a rusted iron key against the wooden piling. "Choice is yours, Eliza. You've got the fire in your belly. You've got the morning star grit. You could be a lady in America, or you could stay here and freeze in the mud with the rest of the shadows." This was the risky opportunity. It was the upward mobility they had whispered about in the gin palaces and the cellars, but it was a ladder with only 1 rung. In the cruel math of the Victorian slums, survival was often a solitary act. To save yourself, you had to step over the person holding your hand. "Go, Liza," Nell said. Her voice was a thin, vibrating version of Eve in the wind. "You're the one who saved the shilling. You're the one who taught me to read hope. If you go, at least one of us is free. At least the dream is real for one." Eliza looked at the black water. She thought of the merchant's greed, the doctor's shadow, and the years of stitched by candlelight. Everything she had suffered was for this moment. This was the bridge. But as she looked at Nell's blue fingernails and her hollowed-out cheeks, a different kind of realization hit her, one that wasn't in the flash talk or the merchant's ledger.
"Loyalty is the only coin we have left, Silas," Eliza said, her voice suddenly turning into iron. "If I go alone, I'm just another merchant. I'm just another sterling, trading a life for a gain. My sister stays. I stay." Silas laughed, a dry, mocking sound.
Then stay and rot. The tide doesn't wait for loyalty. The tide only waits for the gold." But Eliza wasn't finished. She stepped closer to Silas, her eyes reflecting the cold gray light of the approaching dawn. "The spice is prime, Silas. You know it. It's worth more than one passage in the hold of a coal ship. I'll give you the spice, and I'll give you the silver shilling in my boot, and I'll give you 2 years of my labor on the other side, a work bond. But we go together, both of us, or none of us." The silence on the wharf was absolute. The only sound was the rhythmic slap, slap, slap of the river against the stones. Silas looked at the spice, then at the silver shilling, and finally at the fierce, unbroken spirit of the girl standing before him. He was a man of greed, but even he recognized a force that could not be bargained with. 2 years, you say?" Silas hissed. "Hard labor, scrubbing the decks and hauling the lines. No complaints, no morning star attitude." 2 years, Eliza vowed, her hand finding Nell's in the dark. Silas snatched the pouch and the coin. He spat on the ground and nodded toward the rowboat. "Get in, before I change my mind and before the blue bottles catch the scent of the cloves." As they stepped into the boat, the bridge to tomorrow finally began to move. They weren't crossing a physical bridge. They were crossing the threshold of their lives. Behind them lay the soot, the hunger, and the sisterhood of the stall. Ahead lay the unknown, a vast, terrifying ocean, and a world that didn't know their names. "We're doing it, Liza," Nell whispered, clutching Eliza's arm as the boat pushed off into the black current. "We're really leaving." "We're leaving now," Eliza replied. She looked back one last time at the silhouette of London, the city that had tried to break them and failed. "We're leaving together. That's the only victory that matters." The boat disappeared into the mist, leaving the wharf empty. The great exhibition's echo was gone. The doctor's shadow was gone. There was only the sound of the oars dipping into the water, and the quiet, steady breathing of 2 girls who had tested the world and found that their loyalty was stronger than its greed. Sunlight through the soot, the unbroken flame. The ship, a weathered and salt-stained vessel named the Wanderer, groaned as it strained against its anchor in the wide, churning mouth of the Thames. Behind it lay the sprawling, smoke-choked monster of Victorian London, a city built on 10,000 chimneys and 1,000,000 broken promises. The fog was still there. It would always be there, a gray, suffocating ghost that clung to the rotten wooden docks and swirled like a drowning spirit around the mast. But as the iron clock tower of St. Paul's struck the final hour of their old existence, something happened that the girls of the market had rarely seen in their lives of grime. The sun, a stubborn golden eye, pierced through the thickest, greasiest layer of the London soot. Eliza stood at the mahogany rail, her hands gripping the cold, salt-crusted wood so hard that her knuckles turned the color of ivory. Beside her, Nell looked back at the receding shoreline, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and wonder. They were no longer the girls of the mud or the shadows of the stall. They were something new, something the city had tried to prevent them from becoming. They were the victors of a war that had no soldiers, only survivors. "Look, Liza," Nell whispered, her voice sounding clear and bell-like in the open air. "The sun, it's hitting the dome of the cathedral. It looks like it's on fire, like the whole city is burning in gold." "It's not just the cathedral, Nell," Eliza replied, her voice sounding deeper and resonant, carried by a strength forged in the sweat trade and a winter's teeth. "It's the soot itself. Look how the very dirt glows. Even the filth of this place cannot hide the light when it finally decides to break through the dark. That is us now. We are the light in the soot." This was the final hard-won lesson of resilience. Resilience was not the absence of the fog, it was the ability to glow in spite of it. As the ship caught the first true wind of the morning, the girls realized that while London had taken their childhood, it had autonomously failed to take their spirits. They had been hungry, they had been sick, and they had been hunted by the merchant's greed and the doctor's shadow, but they remained unbroken. "Do you think they'll remember us?" Nell asked, her eyes reflecting the dancing amber light on the waves. I paused, a long, heavy silence stretching between them. I thought of the sisterhood of the stall. I thought of the thousands of girls still waking up in the damp, rat-infested cellars, preparing to cry apples and violets into the indifferent mist. "They won't remember our names, Nell," Eliza said softly, "because we are still with them. Every time a girl stands her ground against a merchant, every time a sister shares her last farthing for a bowl of broth, we are there. We've left the mud, but we've left a trail of fire behind us. We've shown them that the bridge to tomorrow isn't just a fairy tale. It's a choice made with blood and grit." In the harsh psychology of the Victorian poor, hope was often seen as a dangerous thing, a flame that could burn you if you weren't careful. But Eliza understood now that hope was the only currency the upstairs world could never tax. It was the only copper gain that couldn't be seized by the law's shadow. The ship's heavy bronze bell rang out, a sharp, triumphant sound that cut through the low, mechanical roar of the river. Clang, clang, clang. It was the sound of the future. "Goodbye, London!" Nell shouted into the wind, her voice echoing off the water. "Goodbye to the hunger! Goodbye to the blue death! You couldn't keep us!" Eliza didn't shout. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small dried apple core, the last physical remnant of her life in Covent Garden. She looked at it for a long meditative moment, remembering the chimes of the cobblestones and the reflections in the mud puddles. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she dropped it into the black, swirling water of the Thames. "Goodbye to the girl who had to hide," Eliza whispered to the wind. As the massive white sails unfurled, like the wings of a great bird catching the salt-heavy wind, the ship began to pull away from the shore. The fog tried to hold it, the soot tried to stain it, but the momentum of 1,000 golden dreams was too much for the city to overcome. The chimes of London faded into a dull, distant hum, eventually swallowed by the rhythmic sound of the waves. The girls stood together, their thin shawls fluttering in the clean, cold, salt air. They were the morning stars of a new world, and as the sun finally cleared the soot crowds of the dying city, they stepped out of the shadow and into the eternal light. "Apples," Eliza whispered to herself, a fierce, secret smile playing on her lips. "Apples for the new day, apples for the free." The fog remained behind them, dark, heavy, and silent, but the girls were gone, and the light they carried within them was something that no darkness, no matter how deep or how ancient, could ever hope to extinguish.